So changing how we sit is important too. Like most of us sit in a way that our hips and our knees are on the same plane. They're at the same height. And that cuts us off from our deep abdominal stabilization systems, when really the way we need to be sitting is with our hips about 2 inches higher than our knees.
Now you're making me self-conscious.
I know. I'm like, okay, I'm looking at my chair right now. Like, can I erase this?
Yeah. Welcome to the Invigor Medical Podcast, where we sit down with medical professionals and discuss a full spectrum of health-related subjects. It all starts in 3, 2, 1.
Hello and welcome to the Invigor Medical Podcast. I'm Natalie, Garland, and I'm here with my lovely co-host, Derek. Thank you for being with us tonight, Derek. And tonight we have with us Mary Richards, who is a yoga practitioner and teacher, anatomy nerd, dirt-worshipping hiker, dog and cat lady, and bibliophile. Mary has been offering integrative health education based on her personal yoga practice and study, which spans nearly 3 decades. Welcome, Mary.
Thank you so much, Natalie and Derek. I'm thrilled to be here.
Awesome. Well, it looks like you have a couple of credentials, which I don't really know and understand what they mean. So would you start with telling us what those credentials are, and then tell us a little bit about your business and what it is that you actually do with all of this knowledge and experience you have?
Sure. So I've been a yoga practitioner for over 30 years and a teacher for over 20. I hold a master's of science in yoga therapy from Maryland University of Integrative Health, which is really a formalization of my 3 decades of practice experience and training. And the emphasis is really on, from my perspective, the individualization of yoga-based science-informed practice to facilitate folks' comfort and ease in living their lives in their bodies. And then I'm also what's called a certified yoga therapist and a member of the International Association of Yoga Therapists, which is the professional organization for folks of my ilk. And then I'm what's called an experienced, an ERYT, an experienced registered yoga teacher with Yoga Alliance at the 500-hour level, though I've had way more than 500 hours of training. And I've been teaching for so long. So the ERYT is just a designation that Yoga Alliance uses to differentiate different levels of experience. And it, again, it's not a certifying organization, but it's a professional registry.
Okay.
And then I'm also what's called a YACEP, a Yoga Alliance Certified Education Provider. So I'm cleared, if you will, with Yoga Alliance to offer continuing education to my fellow professionals in the field, as well as other movement and integrative health types.
Okay. So how do you take all of that knowledge? Well, how does that knowledge and experience play into what you're doing in your day-to-day? Are you teaching classes? Are you like doing coaching? Like, what does that look like?
Well, I used to teach 19 classes a week.
Oh, wow.
Which is insane, by the way. But I stopped doing that in 2016 because I really decided that what I wanted to focus on was professional education in the field. There's not a lot of science literacy, if you will, in the yoga world. And in fact, there's a certain degree of science resistance.
Mysticism.
Yes. And so I really turned my attention to focusing on things like, anatomy, kinesiology, and what I like to call physical literacy, movement literacy in the context of the sea of gravity. And so I no longer teach group classes in studios. What I do is I teach online extended courses like experiential anatomy, which is a 50-hour course that I offer with my dear partners, Judith Hanson-Lassiter and Lizzie Lassiter. And then a variety of other multi-week digital courses that help folks delve deeper into the various aspects of yoga practice from a place of science information. And I also see folks privately, and I have my first book coming out.
Oh, that's fantastic.
That's so exciting. What's the book?
So my book is called Teach People, Not Poses, Lessons in Yoga, Anatomy, and Functional Movement to Unlock Body Intelligence. And it's being published by Shambhala, which I just like to point out publishes His Holiness the Dalai Lama, which knocks my socks off. So that comes out August 29th. In fact, I just saw my back cover design today.
Oh my goch, that must feel so
fantastic.
exciting.
It's really exciting. I've wanted to write a book for decades. And this is really an introduction, if you will, to what I consider the fundamental body literacy and movement literacy information and skills that movement professionals need in their toolkit to facilitate safe and effective practice for folks who come to them on the mat.
So, Mary, when you talk about movement professionals, I'm guessing that entails a wider range of people, from anywhere from personal trainers to physical therapists. Can you kind of dive a little bit more into that, and specifically how you can help people in those fields?
Yes, I love that question, Derek. I see PTs, DPTs, Feldenkrais practitioners, Alexander Technique folks. Alexander Technique tends to be a bit more esoteric, though. If people work in the performing arts, they're familiar with it, as well as Pilates instructors, massage therapists, Rolfers, and other structural integration types. And what I specifically focus on is, of course, how yoga and the physical exercises and the breathing practices, as well as the more contemplative aspects of practice, like developing your concentration and meditation skills, can facilitate a whole person approach to health.
Yeah.
And in particular, I focus on how we need to understand movement in the context of gravity, because I don't know if you all have ever been in a yoga class yourselves.
Oh,
yeah. Natalie, and both of you have.
Yes.
So some of it is rather gravity defying. Would you agree with that statement?
100%.
No doubt about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The only thing that's not gravity defying in those classes for me is the sweat dripping off my face and hitting the mat very loudly while I hold that plank for way too long.
Yes. So this is something that, I've been in the field for decades now, and we tend to have a bias toward end ranges of mobility without first establishing the fundamental body stabilization and joint stabilizing skills that are necessary to stand on our heads safely. And so that's what I do, is I help folks identify structure, so specifically skeletal structure, so that they don't get lost in the weeds of soft tissue, because it's very easy to conflate, a juicier, curvier bottom with a sway back. But when you understand the bony landmarks, where to look for the bony landmarks of the lumbopelvic hip complex, you're better prepared to actually understand how that person is standing in front of you and what adjustments they need to make in terms of, width of base in their feet or muscle activation patterns, so that they actually can abide in a state of ease and effortless effort.
It's wild to hear you talk about this in such great detail. And clearly you have a lot of knowledge and expertise to back these things up. I think that a lot of people kind of view yoga as this sort of frou-frou mystic, it's all about hum and namaste. And what I'm getting from you is that there's just so much behind this and so much potential to overall health. We're talking also about how important movement is as you age and how those things tie in. And it just, can you speak to that a little bit about the importance of these kinds of movements as we age and how it benefits us to have that kind of body knowledge and movement?
Oh, Natalie, you've just made my heart sing with joy. This is one of my favorite things to talk about, because certainly there is a woo-woo component in yoga. You can spin your chakras like dinner plates if you want. You can let your freak flag fly.
Can you teach that? Can you teach me that? I want to know how to do that.
I can actually. But But here's the thing, in my experience, and I've been a teacher now for almost 23 years, what brings people to the mat is typically some sort of physical concern. Maybe they've got chronic low back pain, or they've had a knee replacement or a hip replacement, or, torn a rotator cuff, or they're having difficulty managing their stress responses. And why then add stress to folks already over full plates by asking them to do things that are inherently odd to the body, like standing on your head or doing downward facing dog, where your head is below the plane of your heart. And what that signals to the nervous system is alert, alert. The head is below the plane of the heart, because we have all of these different built-in autopilot systems called writing reflexes that are designed to keep ourselves upright and our heads on a swivel so that we can take in information from our environment to make decisions, right?
Right.
You with me?
I'm with you.
And so what I think is so important for yoga professionals in particular is that we meet people where they are, instead of trying to impose conformity with aesthetics of asana. Asana are the physical poses of yoga.
Okay.
Because when you look at a yoga book, and there are gazillions of them, what you'll see typically is you'll see a very slim person in what looks to be a very complex expression of body posture.
Right.
And you both, Derek and Natalie, have been on yoga mats before, and you've seen some of these expressions of posture, and they are difficult. And yet what is often not taught in class is just the fundamental nuts and bolts of abdominal stabilization. Oh, and also then looking at people's bony structure, again, their physical architecture, so that we can individualize instructional requests for the person. Because the reality is, and I say this in my book as a mantra, everybody's unique, just like everyone else. And yoga came out of individualized instruction. And so really the group class model is an invention of modern times that really doesn't correlate with the millennia of tradition, where practice was highly personalized to the person. And I believe by facilitating literacy in structural anatomy, and then the science of movement, again, in the context of gravity, we help folks co-create conditions where they can practice yoga poses safely for themselves.
That's really important, I think. I remember, I think that it's easy, especially if you enjoy fitness and you're like, I'm going to try yoga and do one of those really cool poses, and you just start working on the pose, right? But I remember seeing a video some years ago that was really the things that you need to do in order to be able to execute that pose are not even close to what that pose looks like. There are these basic stretches and movements that you need to do in order to be prepped. And it's so easy to just get frustrated and be like, well, throw the mat out the window. I can't do this anymore.
Yes, and it discourages people because they're moving too far too fast. It increases the possibility for injury. And this is particularly important in yoga, because yoga asana, the physical practice, is really, in my opinion, the only holistic system of health that uniquely targets the joint segments of the body. Because we're asking people to sit in lotus pose, with really, really deep knee flexion, and then their feet tucked on top of their thighs close to the hips. Or we're asking people to take arm and leg positions where they're bound into those positions at end ranges of motion, and they may not have the neuromuscular training to actually handle that load and strain. So, for instance, if I'm going to teach someone how to do downward facing dog, which is that inverted V position, I want to make sure that they can do at least 10 push-ups. Because the pelvis is the largest, heaviest region of the body. And in downward facing dog, I'm asking my students to lift their pelvis up in the air and much higher than their head while their head is hanging down. So again, all of their riding reflexes, their kind of gravity positioning system in the body, which is called proprioception, is already on high alert. And so I want to establish the fundamental strength skills that people need so that they don't jack up their shoulders or their low backs when they're doing downward facing dog.
You know, a lot of the stuff that you've touched on so far, it's like little bells ringing in my ear, because here at Invigor Medical, a big part of what our mission is to help people as they age be able to live their best lives, and be able to do the things that they want to do, and all the things you're talking about: proprioception, strength, joint mobility, structural of the bones. You know, as we age, obviously all those things like go down, and the more we can do now to prevent those things, and some of them are unavoidable, like osteoporosis, or just like the natural kyphosis of when bodies start to hunch over and they start to cave in, and things become harder to do on a regular basis. I'd be curious, have you worked with any clients that are aging, and what is kind of your method, or what is your approach to helping people optimize their lives and their movement patterns for longevity?
Oh, yes. Yes. So, Derek, I'd like to say that, aging is real.
Oh, yeah.
But one of the things we can do, especially with yoga asana, is we can slow progression. And my oldest yoga students, I've worked with folks that are 96 and still able to get down to the floor and up off of the floor. I've worked with them for 20 years and preserved that foundational functional mobility, because the reality of movement training, whatever it is, use it or lose it.
Right.
Right. And the way that we can facilitate usage through the life cycle is to make sure that we're not overloading too far, too fast, too hard, but we're really pacing ourselves and doing a little bit every day. And this is the key, consistency, I believe, is the highest form of discipline. And we often have an idea, we're our own worst enemies, where we think we need to go to an hour-long session at the gym or a 90-minute yoga class to benefit, when the reality is, and the exercise science backs me up on this, is 10 minutes a day. Little movement breaks throughout the day has a cumulative effect that can slow the progression of loss of bone density. I've worked with lots of folks with osteoporosis, osteopenia, with bilateral lumbar fusion, rods in their necks and their low backs, with scoliosis, with syrinx in their spine, things like that, in their spinal cord.
My back hurts just thinking about all of this.
Right. But see, it doesn't have to be a tale of woe. And especially as we age, it's very important that we do weight-bearing exercise to preserve what we have. And research is increasingly demonstrating that we can gain some muscle mass by doing resistance exercise through, body weight, which is what yoga asana is body weight based exercise. We can actually, build strength and muscle, even if we're 80 years old, as long as we're consistent and we don't overwork. Now we also don't want to underwork,
Right.
you know?
Right. Well, you mentioned something that we wanted to touch on anyway, which is, just the regular immobility of most of our lives, sitting at desks and all of that. So what are some tips or tricks that you could give to those listeners that are, in a job where they don't require a lot of movement and they're sitting at a desk? What are some basic things that they could do daily at their desk, and how often, to really help improve their movement and their bone density and their overall longevity of health?
Oh, this is one of my favorite things to talk about.
That's why we brought you on.
Yay.
Because I know lots of desk drivers. I live in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, and I see a lot of folks who, will work 12 and 14-hour days, and they don't get up, they don't hydrate, they don't feed themselves, they're not sleeping well. And there are so many things that we can do just sitting at our desks that don't require special equipment or getting a sweat on. For instance, just doing heel raises. Setting a timer on your desktop or your smartwatch or your phone that once an hour, you're going to do 3 minutes of just sitting at your desk with your shoes on, heel raises, working the calves. People underestimate how metabolically active the calf muscles are in the body and how integrally important those muscles are for our balance and our mobility.
We actually had a guest previously on the podcast say that exact same thing. And there's actually studies behind this, that if you essentially just do these calf raises throughout the day, that it can actually have a significant impact on your metabolism, and you can burn like significantly more calories throughout the day.
How did I not know this?
It's very impactful. Yeah, there's actually scientific studies about this that we'll have to like post with the episode. But yeah, it's pretty cool stuff.
Well, you know what I'm doing as soon as we're done recording? I'm setting that
doing
timer.
It right now.
I'm doing it right now.
Me too, because I'm wearing heels, so I'm always got the heels up.
Throw in some compression socks with that,
Oh my gosh. I'm going to be setting that timer for when I am at my desk to be doing that, because that's just something I never would have thought of. I've done before kind of like the cat-cow at the desk when I start to feel all of that kind of stiffness come in. But to me, I'm usually thinking more about stretching. In those moments, I'm not really thinking about muscle activation.
Yes. And stretching is great. You know, clearly as a yoga person, I have a bias towards stretching. But here's the thing. We often get things out of order and we stretch when we actually need strength.
Okay.
And one of the governing principles that I rely on as both a yoga teacher and a yoga therapist who does specialize in the therapeutic application of the practice is I focus on stability before mobility at all times, because stability is the key to safe and efficient movement. And so one of the simple things we can do as well is after 45 to 50 minutes of sitting, because we're really not bio-designed to sit for extended periods of time. You have that timer and you just stand up. You stand up. You can even do squats into your desk chair as long as it's not going to roll away from you, and you put your hands on your desk and you can do standing heel raises. You can just shift your weight from side to side, do abduction leg lifts, abduction leg lifts, where you're just lifting your leg out to the side. Those things have a profound impact on, venous return to the heart, our efficiency of breath, all of these things that are necessary to maintain a felt sense of vitality. And again, we don't have to get a sweat on, but just standing up for, a few minutes every hour and doing some basic exercises that no one's even going to necessarily know you're doing them. And if they do, you invite them, into your world, because everyone benefits. Because here's the other thing, motion is lotion. And we get stiff and we want to stretch when we're seated for an extended period of time because our body has stagnated. It's like, this is hard, you know?
Yeah.
We rely on the little movements of the spine to try and support our seated posture. And that's not even their job. You know, that's really the deep abdominal structures, especially the iliopsoas, these postural control muscles that need to be working at a low level of, and that's what they're designed to do. They're muscles of endurance to sustain our posture. And so changing how we sit is important too. Like most of us sit in a way that our hips and our knees are on the same plane. They're at the same height. And that cuts us off from our deep abdominal stabilization systems, when really the way we need to be sitting is with our hips about 2 inches higher than our knees.
No, you're making me self-conscious.
I know. I'm like,
okay,
I'm looking at my chair right now. Like, can I erase this?
Yeah.
But you'll feel the difference if you do just check. If you just move to the front edge of your seat and find your, what we call in yoga, your sitting bones or your ischial tuberosities, you sit on those bones rather than the soft flesh of the buttocks, and automatically you'll feel your belly cavity open up a bit and your chest lift. Yes.
Yes. Oh, I'm just thinking if anybody watching this podcast and seeing me and Derek just slightly, I can like see you out of the corner of my eye, and I can feel myself like just making these adjustments as you talk, and I'm like becoming aware of how my body's sitting and moving, and I'm just wondering how it's going to look on the record.
It is going to be pretty interesting.
But that also makes me excited for people to listen to it, and whether they're driving in their car or whatever's happening, and they start to notice and think about, because would you say that one of the best things that people can do to get started is to become aware of their bodies and what they're doing in their regular daily movements?
Oh, yes, absolutely. The first thing, and this ties to yoga practice directly. So yoga is an 8-limbed path, and asana, the physical practice, is just one of those limbs. And 2 of the limbs are concentration and meditation. And concentration comes before meditation for very specific reasons, which is that we need to cultivate our attentive discipline to notice how we feel here and now. And so just paying attention to what's alive in our bodies, our somatosensory awareness, is the first step to wellness, in my opinion. And so paying attention to how we sit, how we stand, how we walk, how we talk, all of these things can lead us to make different choices in, how you adjust your car seat, for instance, because driving can wreak havoc on sacroiliac joints, for instance, because we're in a position of rotation, because we have our right foot forward on the accelerator and using the brake, and that requires enough resistance that it can imbalance our sacroiliac. And so adjusting our car seat so that our bum is higher than our knees is the first thing that we can do. And the other thing that's really helpful is to take a small towel or a washcloth and roll it up into a tube and place that vertically behind our left hip, behind our left sacroiliac joint, so it balances the pelvis when we're driving, especially if you sit in traffic or you drive a manual transmission, which is, a millennial and Gen Z anti-theft device.
Anti-theft device. I love that. Exactly. Oh, man. Yeah, there's so many.
These are small things that we can do that have a profound effect on our felt sense of comfort. Wow. And this is the whole organizing principle behind the physical practices of yoga, is we can't actually learn to concentrate and meditate unless we're first comfortable and steady in our bodies.
Yeah. These 2 additional branches that you just talked about are obviously very cognitive in nature. Like they have very much to do with the mind and the mental plane. How have you seen these branches, because I know this is a large part of your work, how have you seen these branches affect overall mental health as people age? Because you've worked with clients that have lived up to be 96. What are the effects that you've seen on those types of clients?
An acceptance, a higher comfort level, if you will, with the actual aging process. It's not a catastrophe.
Right.
And this comes with, chronic conditions related to aging. I've worked with folks with really severe hyperkyphosis, the very rounded upper back, hunchback of Notre Dame sort of effect.
It's such a hard condition to deal with.
Oh, and the forward head position that comes from that, because again, the body's trying to keep the gaze level so that you can take in information from your surroundings. So folks develop that crane neck, which causes all kinds of problems. And to a certain extent, we can ameliorate some of the musculoskeletal discomfort that comes with those conditions, but it's not likely that we're going to be able to correct them because we've come too late to the party, But what we can do, especially when we help people learn to pay attention to the sensations and actions of their breath, and then the thoughts that accompany the sensations of their breath, is it shifts their relationship with their bodily state in such a way that it's a type of enemy imaging, if you know what I mean. So we can make friends with ourselves as we are right now. And once we become friendly with ourselves, in my experience, that tends to enliven wonderful changes in our self-relationship, where we're no longer shaming and blaming ourselves for how we got into this situation in the first place, but instead we cultivate a sense of agency and autonomy that allows us to believe that what we're doing is good enough and we can continue doing it.
I love hearing you talk about all these subjects, because not only is it clear that you have such a wide range of knowledge in this, but also that you're so passionate about it. And so it's just, as you're talking, I'm thinking, how did she even get started here? Did you just go to a yoga class one day and you're like, this is it. This is the game changer?
No. Yeah. Okay. So I'll tell you the story.
Please.
It's funny, I think. So in my previous life, I actually worked in nuclear non-proliferation for the U.S. government.
Wow.
Wow, that's not what I thought you were going to say.
I know. So I was an NCAA athlete. I was a track and field athlete.
Okay.
I threw shot put, discus, jav, hammer, loved the weight room.
She's so cool, she can call it jav.
Oh, yeah.
We can't call it that.
And so I was always very physical. I'd started competitive athletics as a very small child, and I was a really kind of precocious reader, which my dad in particular really facilitated with me because he was a literature major from the University of Virginia. And so he introduced me when I was about 14 years old to the seminal text of yoga called the Bhagavad Gita, which is the song of Krishna, the song of the Lord. Okay. And I really just connected with that. And so I'd always had a proclivity, if you will, a propensity toward yoga philosophy and Buddhism in particular. And I go off to undergrad and I major in international affairs with a concentration in U.S. national security studies and a minor in Russian.
Wow.
And I lived in the Soviet Union right after the Berlin Wall came down.
Wow.
And I was in a language immersion program. And I had a job waiting for me when I got out of undergrad. And this job necessitated that I work in a secure communications vault. And I worked shifts. And those shifts changed every 7 to 10 days. And so it's not like if you're working the 11 p.m. to 8 a.m. shift, you can take a nap at 3 a.m. There's a reason why we were there 24/7.
Right.
And so I was the youngin in the skiff, and I worked with a foreign service officer, and so there was adult supervision, and I was always rolling around on the floor, when it was possible, doing push-ups and planks and leg lifts and monster walks and all this stuff to stay awake. And one evening, my watch partner, who had been posted in India, said to me, "Hey, have you ever tried yoga?" And I was mid something on the floor, and I pop up to a seated position. I said, "No, but I've read the Bhagavad Gita and the Dhamma, and it just, fire hosed her." And she was like, "Okay, young one, I'm going to bring in this is the days of VHS tapes. This is back in 1992. And she brings in this VHS tape called The Unworkout with Dixie Carter. Dixie Carter was on this fabulous show called Designing Women with Annie Potts and Delta Burke. And it was about this interior design practice in Atlanta, Georgia. And they were, saucy women, sort of like middle-aged golden girls, if you will.
Love it.
Well, and it turns out Dixie Carter was a trained Vini yoga teacher. And Vini yoga is a specific lineage of yoga that probably the eminent voice in the United States for Vini yoga is Gary Krafsow, who's just fantastic. And so she gave me this tape and I wore it out, literally demagnetized it. I watched it so much. And I went down one day to the desk, the South Asian Affairs desk, because if anyone's going to know about India, it's those folks. And I said, "So I'm really interested in yoga. Is there any sort of place I can go to buy books about it?" And the person at the desk said, "Yes, there's this bookstore in Springfield, Virginia called Nataraj Books." Nataraj means dancer in Sanskrit. It's the king dancers bookstore. And I was like, sweet, I know exactly where that shopping center is. And I go over there and I made the fellow's sales year. I literally bought like 40 books on yoga. And one of them that I bought was BKS Iyengar's Light on Yoga, which is kind of one of the Bibles, if you will, of modern postural yoga practice. And I'm kind of autodidactic by nature. And he had in the back of the book a 365-day course of practice. And I was like, sweet, here's a map. And so that's how I began. And then I would go up to, there weren't many yoga studios back then. This is the early 90s. It's not like now where you throw a rock and you hit a yoga studio, you know? And so I would go up to Bethesda, Maryland, which, if you've ever been in the DC metropolitan area, that might as well be London, because of traffic.
Oh my goodness.
And I would take a 90-minute metro ride to go to classes at this studio in Iyengar's lineage. And that's how I got started. And I would go to classes, on my days off. And I would, I wore this tape out from my colleague and I just never looked back. And then in 2000, I was in a yoga class, and the teacher, and I saw this teacher every week, usually twice a week, came up to me after class one day and said, "Hey, have you ever thought of teaching yoga?" And I said, "No, I have a real job." That's what I said, because I think I'm funny. And she said, "That's exactly why you can teach. No ego." And I was like, really? I did gymnastics as a kid and I swam competitively for 14 years and I was a thrower and in undergrad and all that. I've always been a jock. I played on the women's rugby team. I was the starting number 8. I've always had a high level of physicality. I'm to this day, a dirt worshiping, tree hugging hiker. And she was like, "I'm telling you, you're going to teach for the rest of your life." And here I am.
Wow.
23 years later, and I have not stopped teaching.
So Mary, another question kind of to continue this story. Over that 23 years, obviously you've learned a lot, even before that, you are, soaking up a lot of knowledge, but over the course of that 23 years, how did your practice of and teaching of yoga change? And at the very beginning of the episode, you talked about how you had to battle some misconceptions about yoga being, woo-woo and having to fight against kind of a resistance within the yoga community of science-based tools. Can you talk about how you were able to get to the point where you are now?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I feel like I should apologize to all of my students when I first started teaching, because I very much taught according to the rules of practice that I had internalized and that had been repeated to me for over a decade. And I took those rules about how asana yoga practice was supposed to look, and I followed them as close to the letter as I could, even when it caused injury for me. But I had this belief that certainly, my yoga teachers, many of whom had been teaching for as long as I had been alive or longer, knew better than me. And I gave away a lot of my power to them. And so when I first started teaching, I was very rigid and very much, this is how we practice plank pose, and we practice triangle pose, like we're in between panes of glass. And your front heel bisects the arch of your back foot exactly. If you're 8 years old, you can get away with that. But at some point, you have to understand you have a sacrum and you need to respect your skeletal width, And so I got injured a lot because I was a yoga teacher's nightmare. I was strong, flexible, and determined. And that was very much the way I taught. And I was this pains me to a certain degree to say, I was very successful at it. I had always had full classes. I was I was celebrated for my ability to recite these rules of practice and also to display them in action. And what happened was, I had a couple of really serious joint injuries as a direct result of hands-on assists in two very common yoga poses. A teacher tore my right rotator cuff. When I had my shoulders in extension, so my hands were behind me, and the teacher came up behind me. So I had my hands in prayerful mudra behind my body in practicing this pose, and the teacher came up behind me and forced my elbows up, and we heard my rotator cuff pop, my supraspinatus, and I unleashed a torrent of profanity that my brother, who was in the Navy, he would have bowed down, because it was quite painful. And then a couple of years later, I was in a lunge type of pose, and the rule, if you will, was that when you're in this lunge pose, your front thigh, the lunging leg, is parallel to the floor. And the instructor came up to me and forcefully externally rotated my front hip to bring me past 90 degrees and tore my labrum.
Oh my goodness.
My hip labrum, that lip of cartilage that helps hold the head of your thigh bone in the hip socket. And I was set up for that injury, not so much because the person was like an NFL linebacker, but because I had been overtaxing those tissues for so long at that point by abiding by these rules of aesthetics rather than function. And those injuries, they were just huge wake-up calls for me, because I kept asking myself, I'm doing everything, air quotes, right. I'm doing everything I'm supposed to be doing. I'm praised for this. I'm pulled out in front of classes. This is how you do this pose. And yet I was getting hurt all of the time. And so what happened was my regular teacher said to me one day, we were practicing a forearm balancing pose where I was literally standing on my forearms, doing a handstand, if you will, but on my forearms. And she had tied my arms together at a certain width. And I said, oh my gosh, this hurts so much. This rotator cuff is still bothering me. I need more space. And she yelled at me in front of the class and said, literally said, shut up. This is how the pose is done. You know how the pose is done. Get upside down now. And I kind of snapped, if you will. And I said, no, this hurts. I'm not going to do it. And she said to me after class, she was like, listen, if you're going to persist in this anatomy stuff, you need to go see Judith Hansen-Lassiter. Judith co-founded Yoga Journal. She's a PT. She's been teaching now for about 54 years. I actually co-teach with her now, which is one of the greatest privileges of my life. And she's my dear friend and mentor. And it just so happened, I guess I have kind of instant karma, that Judith was doing a weekend workshop in Charlottesville, Virginia, which is about 110 miles south of me, on the shoulder, a 4-day workshop on anatomy and kinesiology of the shoulder. And I was like, fine, I will go to that workshop. And I did, and I haven't looked back.
Wow.
Because that workshop, it was the first time any teacher or coach had asked for my consent to touch and waited to receive my yes or no. And it was the first person who spoke to me in a way that I understood as a former NCAA athlete, which is that, if you're going to throw a shot put, for instance, you don't hold your shoulder blade down and then try to put the shot. You actually throw from your shoulder blade, from your scapula. Like, makes so much sense that you want the joint cavity oriented in the direction that you want the limb to move. In retrospect. Yet in yoga, we're told all the time, for instance, in downward facing dog, where we're upside down in a closed chain, our hands and feet planted on the mat, we're told to pull our shoulder blades the opposite direction that our arms are positioned. And this is how we get hurt. Because we're creating schizophrenic conditions in the joint. We're separating the joint cavity from the joint convexity, which violates the fundamental principle of joint movement, which is called the law of concave convex motion, which basically states we achieve normal maximal movement when the concavity moves over and around the convexity. In other words, when the cave of the joint is moving over and around with the rounded knob of the limb. And so it was just such a light bulb for me, this workshop. And I had also been told, oh, you have a sway back, you have a sway back. Well, I don't have a sway back. I have a backpacker's bottom. I've got great glutes, to this day, even at 53 with a titanium hip, I can still push 275 pounds on a leg sled for reps.
Wow.
Because I have great glutes. And, but people were confusing my soft tissue for structure and telling me to tuck my tailbone, tuck my tailbone, tuck my tailbone. And of course, the problem with that when you're in a standing posture is that unwedges you at your sacroiliac joints and takes your abdominal muscles out of the stabilization equation. Wow. So it creates all of these problems. So all of these rules that we're perpetuating in yoga actually had no bearing on anatomical or kinesiologic reality. And so because of these injuries, I went back to school.
Wow. And
I started taking, anatomy classes, comparative anatomy and physiology, kinesiology, clinical kinesiology, pathophys, all of these things. I was originally on a DPT track, a doctor of physical therapy track. But for me, I was like, I don't want to be a PT. I'm a yoga teacher through and through. I love this practice because it's not just about physical exercise. It's also about training our breath and training our attention and developing our concentration and our meditation and understanding our ethics and our values. And so I eventually ended up getting a master's of science in yoga therapy. And it changed, plus when you're working with 96-year-olds, and I had private clients in their 80s, it was very clear to me that I didn't want to break them.
Yeah.
And they were also a lot smarter than me because they had lived in their bodies longer. And what I realized was I really needed to learn to listen to people and to give them the space to actually communicate with me. And by learning to do that with others, it taught me to do it for myself. So now I'm a much nicer yoga teacher. You're still going to do planks with me, but I'm going to be much nicer about it.
It just kills me that instructor that said, if you're going to focus on this anatomy stuff, it's like, oh, anatomy stuff, because that's not important.
I would have told her, nah, I'm going to stay at home today.
Yeah.
Yes. But here's the thing. And in yoga standards, and I was on the teaching standards committee, the digital standards committee for Yoga Alliance, the standards are so loose. And so they're better now than, from years ago. But you could count chakra anatomy, like these vortices of energy that correlate with different regions of our bodies. That would count as anatomy. Like, what? That's an interesting idea. It's interesting conceptually, but it's not going to help folks with low back pain or hip pain. And it's not going to help folks figure out how to safely position their knees when they're doing lunges. And so I believe that there's such a necessity in the yoga world in particular, but honestly also in Pilates, in Feldenkrais, and in physical education classes in K through 12 for actual anatomically realistic instruction. Let's teach people the names of their parts, where they're located, and what those parts indicate is possible in terms of our movement.
So I'm curious, what advice would you give, whether it's someone who's getting a little on in years and is looking to find a way to age with some more physicality and flexibility, or someone who might be a little younger in their 20s or 30s, who wants to start now to do the long path? For those two, what advice would you give to those two groups? Maybe it's the same, maybe it's different, I don't know, on where to start. Now that we've covered all of this, what's the benefits of yoga, but also so much more in anatomy and all of these deeper ideas and lessons that you have within it. Where do we begin?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Most of us get hurt when we're younger. When we think we
are invincible.
Yeah. And I have a 22-year-old son and a 19-year-old daughter. And I'm constantly, saying to them, you've only got, so much in those Golgi tendon receptors, so be sure you're feeding yourself well and all that. But this is one of the great things that Yoga Alliance offers is you can go online to yogaalliance.org and look up, put in your zip code and find the yoga studios around you. And you can also look at ratings for the studio. You can go to their website and find out who their teachers are and see what folks say about them. And I'm not saying that, reviews are everything, but they're helpful. And in particular, what we want is we really want to start in a beginner's class. Even if you're really fit and bendy and strong, you still want to start in a level 1 beginner's gentle class, because yoga is going to ask you to make movements that you've likely not done before with any frequency. And so that's particularly important. And especially for folks that are older, they want to stick to classes that are unheated. Don't go to a hot vinyasa class. I mean, I could talk about, that's its own conversation.
I don't like them.
Yeah. Well, here's
fan.
the thing, folks, you don't detox when you're sweating. You're just dehydrating. I hear so many, I went to this class and it was 105 degrees and I totally detoxed. I'm like, no, you just, you need electrolytes, for God's sake. That's not how sweat works. That's what your liver and your kidneys do,
Yeah.
So is detoxification. And so don't go to the hardest class, go to the easiest one for you. And especially for older folks, and if they've had any sort of joint intervention, like an ACL reconstruction or, Tommy John surgery, something like that, talk to a physical therapist. Talk to a physical therapist and find out what's contraindicated for you specifically and what it is you should look for in a yoga class, because the reality is yoga is really becoming commonplace. And we hear about it in professional journals from, specific medical journals to, pop culture, to Time magazine or Yoga Journal. So people know about it, and healthcare providers, especially those that are involved in physical medicine, are going to have some opinions about it. Get those opinions and be realistic. If you have difficulty putting on your socks and shoes in the morning, maybe you want to look at a chair yoga class. This is the thing. Let's be, compassionate toward ourselves, because the reality is, we start where we are and we go from there. So let's be reasonable in our assessment of where we are today, and let where we want to go, let that evolve as you gain familiarity with a movement system like yoga.
That's wonderful. I'm wondering also, and I love the website that you mentioned to go in and look for studios. As people are looking for yoga instructors within these studios, are there any specific classifications or designations or credentials that they should look out for when taking classes? Could you tell us what are, because I'm sure there's probably private credentials you can get or whatever. So what is kind of the golden ticket to know, okay, this instructor really knows their stuff?
Yeah, you really want to look for someone who has all the initials after their name. The EYT 500, for instance. That's someone that has a higher level of training. You want to look for someone, in my opinion, that's got at least 10 years of teaching experience. Because one of the things that I particularly focus on is I like to share with my colleagues how to work with beginners, because teaching beginners is the hardest thing, because you're often dealing with folks who have stuff going on in their bodies, in their psycho-emotional space, and they may or may not be able to get up and down the stairs with ease. And so you really want a more experienced teacher. So, let's say you find your local studio, and the studio is going to have a list of meet our teachers. Look up those teachers on Yoga Alliance.
Okay.
And see what are their credentials. Where did they do their training? How many hours have they been teaching? Because all of that is included at Yoga Alliance's site. Now, I'll tell you, some of us who are long in the tooth, we aren't so great about updating our hours. I mean, I think I've got over 20,000 listed, but that's good. You want someone who at least has that that experienced RYT after their name, and ideally 500 hours or more. And as a bonus, you'd like to see someone who's also a member of IAYT, the International Association of Yoga Therapists. Because again, they're going to have a different layer of training. Now, not everyone is going to be a structural yoga person like me. You're going to have some folks who really focus on restorative practices. There's specifically something called restorative yoga, where you set yourself up in supported positions of comfort and ease, and you do progressive relaxation, for instance. So look people up, read their bios, and then go observe a class. And just be straight with the student. You can go in and say, hey, I'm new to yoga. is it okay? I'm happy to pay the class fee, and sit in the back corner and see if you dig it. Because you may be like, this isn't for me. Or you may be, oh yes, I want to try this. So, take a yoga mat and sit in the corner and see if it's something you want to experience for yourself. But do your due diligence.
Good advice.
Awesome. Well, hey, Mary, this has been a wonderful conversation. Where can people find you? And I know you mentioned at the beginning of your podcast that there's a book coming out. When is that coming out, and where can people go to find that?
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. August 29th, Teach People Not Poses. And it's on Amazon.com and bookshop.org. My publisher, Shambhala. And I have a website, yogawithmaryrichards.com. I also do a podcast myself with my partner in crime, Lizzie Lassiter, called Somatic Self-Care, and you can find that on iTunes. And you can find me on Instagram, Yoga with Mary Richards. And you'll see pictures of my dog and cat there. I'm not going to lie.
Perfect.
Great.
Mary, this has been so wonderful. I feel like I even learned so much, and I feel inspired to get back into yoga more than I have been. And there's just so much useful information, especially for me to think about, because I tend to get into let's do the big poses. And you're just really beautiful reminder of how basic movements can still be really impactful. So thank you so much for taking the time to sit with us this evening.
Thank you all so much, Natalie and Derek. I've really enjoyed this immensely.
All right.
Awesome.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.